And now, a passage from Volume 1 of A History of the Northern Peninsula of Michigan and Its People, from Chapter 14, A Kingdom Within a Republic, The Rise and Fall of King Strang and His Kingdom. The history of the Upper Peninsula has contained more than the ordinary of curious incidents occasioned largely by the individualism of the men at the helm on each particular occasion. At the dawn of her statehood, the strange incident of the Toledo War was one, but a still more uncommon experience within the Upper Peninsula was that of the government of King Strang on Beaver Island in the county of Mackinac in the decade beginning with 1846. The southern shore of the easterly part of the Upper Peninsula is skirted by an archipelago which is made up of the three groups of islands known as the Beaver, the Fox, and the Manitous. They were within the range of travel of most of the early visitors to and settlers in this portion of the country, and it is with the Beavers that this portion of our history has principally to deal. As the main island of this group, Beaver Island is within easy reach of Mackinac, which has been prominently connected with the history of the state from its very beginning. It can readily be understood that the natural advantages and scenic beauty of the islands early attracted attention. There are 12 islands in this group, of which Big Beaver is the largest, being about 12 miles in length north and south, and with about 6 miles as its greatest width. Others in the group are ornamented with such common names as Garden, Hog, High, and Gull, while to one we find was given the classic name of Peros, and to another the apostolic Patmos. This group of islands has from the earliest and still has the reputation of furnishing the best fishing along the lakes, being the natural home of the Mackinac trout. Big Beaver was possessed of many advantages, including beautiful banks, which rise gradually until the surface of the island stands at an altitude of from 40 to 80 feet above the lake. Within the island are numerous beautiful lakes, one of which covers over 1,000 acres of land, and the whole island was finely timbered, so that it stood out invitingly to all passers-by upon the waterway of the Straits, the main highway of travel in those early days. This country was still comparatively new and wild in 1846, and there were but few inhabitants, those of the islands in question being fishermen and traders. Thus it was in that year when James Strang first visited the place and decided upon it as the site whereon to establish his kingdom. To the strong individualism of Strang alone, and the fact that the country was then new and but semi-civilized, must be attributed whatever of success attended his pretentious effort, and for a time it had the appearance of being entirely successful. While the incident may be without a parallel in the history of Republican government, there are many features thereof akin to the efforts of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and John Alexander Dowie. James Jesse Strang was born in Scipio, Cayuga County, New York, March 21, 1813, the son of a farmer and a descendant, it is claimed, of Henry de Lestrange, who came from England with the Duke of York. It is highly probable that he inherited some of the ambitions as well as the characteristics of his pioneer ancestors of the 17th century, and that his Christian name was in memory of the king from whom the Duke obtained his valuable patents, and his mother's maiden name likewise was James. The planting of those ambitions in the new and virgin soil of the West resulted in the events of this chapter. Strang was educated in the common schools at Hanover, New York, to which place the family removed when James was a child. Like other farmer boys of his time, he found that the matter of acquiring an education required persistent work, which had to be accompanied by the ordinary work of the farm. But he was persistent, and as he grew towards the years of manhood, he took up the reading of law while still at work on the home farm. He early acquired the reading habit, and, being possessed of a retentive memory, he became well informed on matters in general. As a lad, he was conspicuous in the rural debates of the times. By those who knew him then, he was described as a young man of eccentric ideas and fluent language, with an abundant knowledge of his own worth and an unconquerable ambition for distinction. He was admitted to the bar at the age of 23, having taught school as a means of support during a portion of the time in which he pursued the study of the law. He seems to have been restless under his early ambitions, and during his early career in the state of his birth, he practiced law at Mayville, edited a paper at Randolph, and was postmaster at Ellington. He was married to Miss Mary Peirce, and with her removed to Burlington, Wisconsin in 1843, where he entered into the practice of law in partnership with C.P. Barnes. For some years, Joseph Smith, the apostle of Mormonism, had been floating on the high tide of prosperity, and from his home at Nauvoo, Illinois, missionaries had gone forth until over 100,000 followers had been brought within the radius of his influence, and in his home he was absolute monarch, commanding a legion of armed men and being the civil head of a prosperous community whose people, though frugal and industrious, were fanatical in the extreme, believing in their ruler as divine, according to his utterances, the sanctity of divine command and prophecy, and yielding to him implicit obedience. Strang had read, while still in the East, of the Mormon triumphs that had come to the prophet of Nauvoo, and of the desire of the leader to enlarge his field of work and influence, and to employ young men of plausible speech, energy, and affable appearance in the work. And in January 1844, soon after his removal to Wisconsin, he visited Nauvoo to meet the much heralded American Muhammad. It is evident that Smith promptly recognized in Strang those elements that were in demand for the work in hand, for he seems to have met with instant favor and rapid promotion. February 25th, he was baptized. March 3rd, was ordained an elder of the Mormon Church, and received at once as a trusted member of its ministry. He was assigned to Wisconsin as his special field of labor, and applied at once to found in that state a branch of the Mormon Church, or, in the language of the sect, to plant a state of Zion. Just at this juncture, breakers appeared in the course of Joseph Smith, and, at the instance of the opponents of Mormonism, Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith were surrendered to the governor of Illinois and lodged in jail at Carthage, whence they were taken out and murdered by a mob. James Strang, who had then been a member of the church for less than 5 months, promptly made claim to the right of succession to the position of Joseph Smith, and in doing so he produced what purported to be an autographed letter from Joseph Smith dated June 18th and bearing the postmark of Nauvoo of June 19th. It was claimed by several witnesses to have been received in the mail at Burlington, Wisconsin, July 9th. The letter was dated 9 days in advance of the murder of Joseph, and was said to have reached Burlington a week before the news of that tragedy. The letter gave details of a vision in which the spirit of Elijah came upon the Mormon prophet, and the voice of God said, "My servant Joseph, thou hast been faithful over many things, and thy reward is glorious. The crown and scepter are thine, and they await thee. But thou hast sinned in some things, and thy punishment is bitter. The whirlwind goeth before, and its clouds are dark, but rest followeth, and to its days there shall be no end. Study the words of the vision, for it tarrieth not. And now, behold, my servant James J. Strang hath come to thee from afar for truth, when he knew it not, and hath not rejected it, but hath faith in thee, the shepherd and stone of Israel, and to him shall the gathering of the people be, for he shall plant a state of Zion in Wisconsin, and I will establish it, and there shall my people have peace and rest, and shall not be moved, for it shall be established on White River, in the lands of Racine and Walworth. And I will have a house built unto me there of stone, and there will I show myself to my people by many mighty works, and the name of the city shall be called Vori, which is, being interpreted, Garden of Peace, for there shall my people have peace and rest, and wax fat and pleasant in the presence of their enemies." The apostles of the church promptly pronounced Strang a presumptuous impostor, and the letter a forgery, and they excommunicated him and drove him from the field of Nauvoo, but he continued to assert his title in sermons and pastoral letters throughout Wisconsin, with the result that he soon gained a small following with whom he founded the city of Vori at Spring Prairie, where he organized his colony on the theory of a community in property ownership. There Strang established and published the Vori Herald as the organ of the primitive Mormons, and as their prophet he was tireless in his labor and skillful in his methods of duping the credulous, wherein he closely imitated those by which Joseph Smith had been successful in the advocacy of his supernatural claims. Brigham Young, soon thereafter, as the Lion of the Lord, was recognized as prophet at Nauvoo, and with the advance of civilization about that place, he led his followers, constituting a large majority of the saints, to his newly chosen field in Utah, while others became followers of Strang at Vori. As Joseph had found in the Ontario Hills, a volume in which the Chronicles of the Book of Mormon were preserved in characters translatable only by the crystalline Urim and Thummim, so the self-styled prophet James discovered in the banks of the White River a miraculously preserved record of the downfall of a great tribe of Israelites that had inhabited the continent centuries ago, and wherein was foretold the coming in the future ages of a mighty prophet who should bring forth the record. Strang found witnesses who declared that on September 14th, 1845, they were led by him to a certain hill near the White River Bridge, where, after digging through the unbroken sward and solid clay that had been manifestly undisturbed for many years, underneath the network of roots of a large oak tree, they found a case of baked earthenware containing 3 brazen plates, both sides of which were used to preserve an alphabetic and pictorial record. Following this miraculous discovery, while in a trance, the Urim and Thummim were brought by an angel of God to the prophet James, and the records on the Vori plates were translated as follows. My people are no more, the mighty are fallen, and the young men slain in battle. Their bones bleached on the plains by the noonday shadow. The houses are leveled with the dust, and in the moat are the walls. They shall be inhabited. I have in the burial served them, and their bones in the death shade towards the sun's rising are covered. They sleep with the mighty dead, and they rest with their fathers. They have fallen in transgression, and are not, but the elect and faithful there shall dwell. The word hath revealed it. God hath sworn to give an inheritance to his people where transgressors perished. The word of God came to me while I mourned in the death shade, saying, I will avenge me on the destroyer. They shall be driven out. Other strangers shall inhabit thy land. I, an ensign, will then set up. The escaped of my people there shall dwell. When the flock disowns the shepherd and build not on the rock, the forerunner men shall kill, but a mighty prophet there shall dwell. I will be his strength, and he shall bring forth the record, record my word, and bury it in the hill of promise. Raja Manchori. Subsequently, Strang made claim of discovery of 18 other metallic sheets, 9 by 7.5 inches in size, called the Plates of Laban, and they were declared to have been written prior to the Babylonish captivity. A translation of the writing on these plates, in addition to 9 sections of direct revelations, composed the Book of the Law of the Lord, printed and published later on Beaver Island by command of the king at the Royal Press, St. James A.R.I. Strang's community at Vori prospered and increased in numbers, and in 1846, his rival Brigham Young having gone west, Strang visited the northern Michigan archipelago and determined to plant a colony there. In May 1847, with 4 companions, he went thither and explored Beaver Island. It is recorded that the few fishermen and traders already there received them with the reverse of hospitality. But as was the custom of explorers in those days, they built a camp of hemlock boughs, and they were, while there, compelled to live on the scanty fare which the woods and the swamps afforded them. During that season, 5 Mormon families permanently settled on the island at Beaver Harbor. The next year, a score of families came, and in 1849, the membership of the colony numbered into the hundreds. Their Gentile neighbors strenuously resisted the immigration of the new sect to the island, but they were persevering, were a sober and industrious people, and soon acquired mastery of the situation. Their village was named after its founder, the city of St. James, which was soon shortened to its present title, that of St. James, and the beautiful bay in the north end of the island was called St. James Bay. From the large lake in the interior of the island, a river outlet flowed to the bay, and this was named the Jordan, while an interior lake was named the Sea of Galilee. A road was built into the interior, and a sawmill constructed to supply the necessities of the growing colony, and a schooner was built and launched as a means of communication with the outside world. The missionary work was pushed forward to such an extent that in 1850 large numbers of converts joined the colony, and St. James was made the permanent headquarters of the new church, and at the annual conference in July of that year it was reorganized as a kingdom, with Strang as king, and to his title of office was affixed also the titles apostle, prophet, seer, revelator, and translator. The communal plan was abandoned, and the lands of the church were apportioned among its members by a system of tithes. The taxes were paid, including the care of the poor and all general expenses. There were numerous counselors and subordinates to the king to do his bidding and execute his commands, but his own energetic personality was injected into affairs in general, and schools were started for the children and debating clubs for the adults. A well-equipped printing press was installed, denominated the Royal Press, from which were issued the orders of the king, and a newspaper, the Northern Islander, which was at first a weekly and finally a daily publication. It is said that the appearance and literary merits of this paper surprised the occasional tourists to this then remote and frontier region. In the government of the island, the principle of prohibition was rigidly enforced and applied not only to liquor but to tea, coffee, and tobacco as well, and the observance of Saturday as the Sabbath and the attendance at church upon that day were compulsory. Rigorous penalties were provided for the offense of prostitution, but polygamy was sanctioned, though there were not to exceed 20 or 25 polygamous families in the colony. King Strang himself had 5 wives, but no other person had to exceed 3, and it was required that ability to support a large family should be shown as a prerequisite to a plural marriage. From the royal press above mentioned was issued the Book of the Law of the Lord, which was claimed to be of divine origin, and it had the sanction of the king. It consists of a series of precepts relating to spiritual and temporal affairs written in imagery of the Bible. It was implicitly received by that entire colony as a revelation miraculously transmitted through a divinely appointed monarch to his favored subjects. Copies of it are now prized as curios in connection with an unusual experience in frontier history. In its dealings with temporal affairs, the book contains minute rules as to diet, attire, and personal habits, the construction of dwellings and roads, the care of forests, and other details of domestic frugality and municipal economy. And those who dispute its divine origin must admit that its author was possessed of ability and a fund of useful information. The construction of a tabernacle was commenced, and other improvements for the comfort of the colony were instituted. The King's Highway still exists, and its name continues, as it were, as an echo of the sentiment that then ruled a kingdom within this republic. One of the domestic orders was to the effect that all women must wear the short skirts and ample pantalettes of the bloomer costume, and while this was generally obeyed, it was the cause of some friction that eventually resulted disastrously to both the king and his population. Though this Mormon colony grew to a population of about 2,000, it never attained a civilization approaching that of Salt Lake City, and the men are spoken of as generally rough and illiterate, and most of the women as sensual and ignorant, though Strang himself was vigorous, intelligent, fluent in speech, of suave manners, and very companionable. He was a master of oratory and skilled in the art of appealing to the untrained sensibilities of his hearers. At times his authority was resisted by some of the more intelligent of his followers, but he received such unfailing support from the majority that resistance was ineffective. Notwithstanding all the faith of his followers, the ruler of this island kingdom was never able to establish relations upon a peace footing with the Gentile neighbors of the islands and neighboring mainlands, whose resistance to Mormon rule sometimes took the form of interference with their meetings, and was met by retaliation after the Mormon colony had grown to strength. This continued until the differences developed into a fierce, bloody border feud that existed for a period of some 6 years, during which time the Mormons gradually made gains until they became almost sole possessors of the islands and were heartily hated and feared along the entire mainland coasts. In his diplomacy, Strang established friendly relations with the Indians of the vicinity, despite their intimate relationship with the traders, who were his bitter enemies. During the continuance of the border warfare, grave accusations of piracy, robbery, and other crimes were freely made against the inhabitants of the islands, and in 1851 the United States officials became convinced not only that the charge of piracy was true, but that the islanders had robbed the United States mails, trespassed upon the government domain, and harbored counterfeiters. Of a sudden, in May 1851, the United States war steamer Michigan appeared in Beaver Harbor with the United States Marshal and District Attorney on board. Strang and about 20 of his followers gracefully submitted to arrest and were taken to Detroit and put upon trial, which lasted 20 days before Judge Wilkins of the United States District Court. With the assistance of Andrew T. McReynolds, Strang conducted the defense, which resulted in acquittal. The verdict is generally attributed to the magnetic effect upon the jury of the dramatic defensive plea of Strang, wherein he posed before the jury as one persecuted for righteousness' sake. His victorious return to his kingdom gained for him added prestige and power, and he easily carried the next county election in Mackinac County in the fall of 1851, and within the fold of the Mormon Church were to be found the newly elected sheriff, prosecutor, and other important officials, while in 1853 Strang successfully won his own election to the office of representative in the legislature of Michigan, in which body he served with such ability as to win the commendation of the people in general. But the situation was a novel one, in that a king who ruled his own people with laws of his own making sat as representative in a legislature to assist in the government of a republican state. And when, after assisting in the making of the laws for the government of the people of the whole state, he returned to his island home, his word alone was law, and he ruled with an absolute authority for the ensuing 2 years. In the conference of 1855, he sternly denounced tea drinkers, tobacco users, and other transgressors, and said, "The law of God shall be kept in this land, or men shall walk over my dead body." This furnished a source of disaffection, to which he added by his systematic efforts to induce his followers more generally to adopt polygamy, so that some of the more enlightened Mormons became disgusted with his pretensions and disgruntled by his imposture, and left his church and joined the forces of the Gentiles. H.D. McCulloch, an educated physician of Baltimore and an ex-surgeon of the United States Army, but a man of unfortunate habits, had become one of the most capable of Strang's disciples, and in him nihilism on the island found an organizing head. In the winter of 1855, difference with his superior ended with his deposition from office in the church, and in the spring he left the island, joined the Gentiles of the coast, and infused into them renewed eagerness for the overthrow of Mormon rule. Among the disaffected of the church were also Thomas Bedford and William Wentworth, whose wives had persistently rebelled against the order for the wearing of the bloomer costume. They upheld their wives in this rebellion and were ready for any scheme of vengeance. Bedford had met with a horsewhipping, and while it could not be traced absolutely to the king's command, it was at the hands of his people, and it did not receive his disapproval. Wentworth was publicly rebuked for some claimed disobedience of the law of the church. These men published their grievances and pointed out the growth of polygamy on the island under the leadership and practice of Strang. It is said that Bedford, immediately after his punishment, determined to kill Strang, and Wentworth and McCulloch, having each his own grievance, joined him in a conspiracy to accomplish that end and to overthrow the kingdom. McCulloch went to Lansing and laid the matter before Governor Bingham, and through his influence the Michigan was again sent to the island, and there entered the harbor June 16, 1856. The captain sent an invitation to Strang to come on board, which invitation he hesitated to accept, but in the afternoon of that day he determined to do so, and left his home for that purpose. As he was about to step upon the pier to enter the boat, Bedford and Wentworth sprang from behind a woodpile and fired upon him with revolvers, and Strang fell mortally wounded, twice in the head and once in the region of the spine. His assailants immediately went aboard the boat and surrendered themselves, and were taken to Mackinac, where they were received with cheers by the crowd that had come to cherish an undying hatred for Strang and his church. They were never put upon trial, but were rather looked upon as heroes. Strang did not die immediately, but was taken to Voree, where he received the devoted care of the lawful wife of his early manhood, an estimable woman who had rejected his revelations, but had herself remained faithful to her belief in the lifelong continuance of the marriage vow. He died July 9, 1856, and was buried in the Cemetery of the Saints at Spring Prairie. The kingdom did not long survive the king. Some of his followers left on the same boat that carried their dying king. His assassination was the signal to an irritated populace to seek revenge, and there gathered from the islands and the neighboring mainlands an exasperated armed mob on pillage bent. The tabernacle was burned, the printing office sacked, the king's library was destroyed, and his house pillaged. The faithful among the servants were given 1 day to leave the island with their movables, and even then they were driven aboard boats without the privilege of securing the property they had gathered to take with them. Much property was destroyed by the invaders by means of axe and torch, but the homesteads were seized and occupied. It was a banishment which demands for many of those who were driven forth from their homes the pity of a righteous public. and the vengeance of that ruthless mob can find no justification even in the outrageous practices of the impostor king and those who fell victims to his magnetic suavity. The king and his kingdom ended ignominiously, and with it the record of this rise and fall of a kingdom within a republic. It is pardonable to digress sufficiently from the realm of history to draw attention of the thoughts of our readers to what might have been, had the ability and energy of this gifted man been directed toward the development of the country within the lines of republican institutions and on a moral, law-abiding basis, or what might have been had the environment been more conducive to the growth of the teaching of this apostle of Mormonism. But deprecating the methods of its procurement, let us be thankful for the early ending of the reign of Mormonism in Michigan. In justice to Mr. Strang, it should be recorded as a set-off to the evils of his misdirected efforts that he was an intelligent student of natural history, and among other approved writings, he contributed to the Smithsonian Institution a report on the natural history of Beaver Island, and wrote and published a book called Ancient and Modern Michilimackinac. If you enjoy forgotten and obscure stories like this one, head on over to my Patreon to support the channel. High Americana is bringing you content you're not going to get anywhere else. Thank you.